also want to talk a little bit culture thing because we're talking about China, everything. You watch some movies this weekend, Barbie or Mission Impossible or Oppenheimer? Anything you want to talk about?
Oh well, the last movie I went to see was last weekend. I went and saw the Barbie movie with my wife.
Okay.
So I have some
Do you
thoughts
like
on
it?
that.
Do you like it?
Not really. I mean, it was mildly entertaining.
Okay.
But what did you think? Have you seen it?
No, I just want to hear you because then I want to talk a little
Okay.
bit of the movies in China. So give me
Okay.
your impression.
Okay, well, it took itself a little too seriously. I mean, this was obviously a movie that was mass marketed because it's based on a popular children's toy. A lot of people said it was a 2-hour toy advertisement, but it was a marketing gimmick. And you can tell the people who made it, they thought they were making some kind of very dramatic piece about feminism and existential philosophy and such. And it's like they took themselves too seriously. So I think that was their first mistake. The other thoughts I had on it, one is they had a character in the film who was the president, and she looked a lot like Kamala Harris. So that kind of indicates the American elite kind of being psyched up for Kamala Harris to be president. And I've written a lot about Kamala Harris. The other thing was that a big part of the plot is what they call brainwashing and deprogramming, right? And that has a particular, that relates a lot to U.S.-China relations historically, because, during the Korean War, there were a lot of American soldiers who were captured. And, in the prison POW camps, prisoners of war camps, they became sympathizers with China. And so then this hysteria started in the United States around brainwashing, right? We thought, oh my God, people are going to be brainwashed. And the CIA spent years trying to figure out. They thought China had some kind of magic. They thought that there was some kind of Asian magic that China was doing to make these GIs do it. It never occurred to them that like maybe the fact that they had been murdering civilians and committing crimes, maybe the fact that America did brutally oppress Black people, would cause people to change their view. But the brainwashing hysteria has been a particularly big part of U.S. culture. And during the 1970s, when you had a rise of political activism in the United States, you also had the rise of various religious sects that were kind of being funded by the American government to counter the rise of communist groups in the United States. And then we got this phenomenon called deprogramming, where, if your legal adult child joined a political group or a religious group you didn't like, you could pay these people and they would go and kidnap them against their will and hold them and try to quote unquote deprogram them or unbrainwash them.
Kind of like a cult.
Yeah, they would accuse the group of being a cult, and so then they hired these people that were called cult deprogrammers, and the parents would pay them thousands of dollars to kidnap people. And this led to all kinds of problems, and eventually the government stepped in and said you can't do this. People went to prison for it, but it was a really big phenomenon in the late 70s of people were alleged to have been brainwashed, and then they were abducted into vans and deprogrammed, and it's kind of an ugly aspect of American history. And it's a weird thing that has gone on. And what I saw in this Barbie movie is a big part of the plot is these women have supposedly been brainwashed by the men. And so Barbie then abducts them into a van and holds them against their will and deprograms them. And you would think this is just a silly thing, but if you know the history of the United States, this actually points to some weird things that have gone on in American history, the brainwashing and deprogram stuff. So I thought about that. The other thing that I thought was amusing is at one point, there's a teenage girl who's portrayed as kind of a brat, but she's using some of the woke language. And she calls Barbie a fascist. And she comes across as kind of a brat. And I thought that was amusing. And the climax of the film is the Ken character having like a breakdown. And he starts crying like a child. Right. And I saw that and I thought, is this what women really want men to be? Right. The film is supposed to be about feminism and empowering women and all of this. But I feel like women don't want men to break down and start crying and acting like 3-year-olds. Women do want their men to be strong. And so I thought that was a little weird. And there's a lot talking about what is the role of men in American society now. And when they portrayed this male character, this very strong, good looking man breaking down and acting like a child, I didn't think that exactly represented what women really want. But that, that kind of shows, some of the confusion between what feminism, what's politically correct among feminism and what women really want. But that was my reaction to the film. I didn't think it was very good overall, but I'm glad I went. My wife had a good time. We both wore pink clothes to the film, took a picture of ourselves for social media. Got to have fun, right? So there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Barbie was also in China, and then it's more or less what you just talked about, the Chinese audience reaction to it. For one thing, Chinese audience does not have the same feeling towards Barbie because they don't grow up with Barbie, the doll. Okay, so that's And the other thing is, I think in general, the U.S. movie probably not as popular as it used to. It used to be, oh, there's a U.S. movie just by itself that lots of people will go watch it. And so Mission Impossible does not do very well in China. Barbie does not. And they talked about the feminist part of it, that how can they portray a man like that, etc. So that's
okay.
that was the reaction. Many of the reactions is like, okay, we're not sure. This is, but they also say, okay, well, that's the thing. What's going on in the United States, right? You have all kinds of the gender neutral thing and many gender thing. That's what's going on, I guess. So
Yes.
that's how people see it. The other reason is, I think, a probably more important reason, there are some pretty good Chinese movies. I want to use this opportunity to talk about two. Okay, this movie's name is called The 30,000 Miles from Chang'an. Chang'an used to be a Tang Dynasty's capital. So it's a film from Light Chaser Animation Studio. Its story happened in the Tang Dynasty. It makes some military commander with a poet Li Bai. Li Bai is regarded as the most famous poet in the Chinese history. So Li Bai was in there, and then some other famous poet. I don't want to give away all the plots, but it's kind of mix of military, but also arts and the poet and all kinds of things mixed together. So it's kind of fun in that sense. It's unusual. And there are lots of Chinese like that movie, because there are many famous poems that we learned, when we were in school. So it's very people familiar with that. And the story itself is supposedly pretty interesting. I haven't watched it. And the movie was released theatrically in Chinese cinema on July 8th. And right now the box office is 1.3 billion yuan, which is about $200 million US. There's no international release date has been announced yet, but it's possible. So that's one movie. And then there's another one. This one probably even more interesting for the Western audience. This one is called a function, and there are different translations about it. Some call it gods of honor, some call it the creation of God. Function is based on a book that written in 200 years ago. And it's the old, like, classic, like good against the evil kind of movie. It involves a hero, villain, cruelty, challenges, and triumph, and also has some mythical figures, fairy tales, etc. It's all mixed together. That one recently released in theatrically in Chinese cinema July 20th, but it's already got a box office of 8 billion yuan, which is slightly over $1 billion US. Again, there's no international release date that has been announced. So those are the two movies which I myself would be interested in watching them. So if they come to North America, what do you think?
Yeah, I would love to see them. And it's very interesting that, in US fantasy films, we talk about, knights and castles in the Middle Ages in Europe. And it seems like these are fantasy films that kind of draw from China's own past. And they're using kind of the feudal time as an allegory to comment on current events, I'm sure, or to touch on, things that affect people in their lives nowadays. That looks interesting to me. One thing that I think is pretty wild is if you look at movies in the United States or books in the United States from a fantasy perspective, one really common theme is you'll have someone who's born as a king or born as a queen or whatever, and then they get lost and they end up among the common people and they have to get their crown back, right? And this is, of course, this is total projection, because in feudalism there is no working your way to the top, right? I mean, it's you're born into your position, but this is an attempt to try and fit the American capitalist rag to riches, work hard and get rich into feudalism and into the fantasy universe. And I see them work very, very hard to try and get that into their fairy tale, movies, which I think is somewhat amusing that they try to do. And I'm curious, do you see this plot device in Chinese fantasy films and books and such, or no?
The second movie, the one that really the good against the evil. What is surprising is actually when you believe the good one actually is not that good. He's the powerful one. He is the king or emperor, and a very capable emperor. So he's not even like a stupid or anything. He actually was fiercely fighting fighters. He's that kind of a person. But in the end, he's not the good guy. The good guy actually is the one who is actually well liked and then thinking through and respect all the other people, etc., etc. So it's not like the traditional, okay, the king, the prince, the princess, that kind of ranking thing. It's not. In fact, in China, if you say ranking, the thing that really ranking high is actually the fairy tales, the people coming from there. In Chinese, throughout the history, all the stories, there is kind of like there's a heaven somewhere up there that is not controlled by any human. So what is the overriding power is actually this heaven. They are the one who more or less decide who, and they don't rank a human like who is higher than the other. They more like ranking who is good, who is bad, who needs to save themselves, who need to save the people or something like that. And that could be anybody. It doesn't have to be a king or a prince or anybody. I mean, it depends on if this person is knowledgeable, if this person is respectable, all that kind of quality. So, so that's very different. And the other thing is, I think people also a little bit tired in China. Like Mission Impossible, I think they tired of the story that one man can save the world. I think they're a little bit done with that kind of story. They more like believe in, okay, there's one man, but this person happened to be in this position and always need a lot of help from other people. That kind of story probably resonate a little bit more now in China. So I think there's a mixed reason why the US movies are not doing as well as the domestic movie now in China.
Well, it's interesting because one observation that was commonly made, during the Cold War is people argued that science fiction was left wing, right? Because the Soviet Union promoted science fiction a lot, outer space and such, and that people argued that fantasy films were fascist because the Nazi government had used fantasy films and had talked about Wagner, etc. And because of that. But there's of course great exceptions to both of those, right? For example, the science fiction author in the United States, Robert Heinlein, who did Starship Troopers, that guy is very right wing and very traditional, and then on top of that, there are many fantasy stories that have a progressive, underlying theme about empowerment, about treating people with love and respect, etc. So neither of these rules are kind of a hold fast rule. What I also think is many people look at the American series Star Wars and they say this isn't really science fiction. This is a fantasy with knights and swords and castles and empires set in outer space, right? And so the biggest so-called science fiction film in the United States is not really science fiction.
No.
So it's very interesting to look at all of this. I know science fiction is rising in popularity in China now as well. So, it's interesting. These are both like fantasy films, but you're telling me the message doesn't kind of match what we see a lot of Western fantasy films having. And that generalization where people see fantasy films as conservative and people see, science fiction as progressive, that's a huge overgeneralization that people make, but it's rooted in kind of the 20th century political categories are a little bit outdated, and I mean, communism in China, the way it is now is not the way communism was in the 20th century, and conservatism around the world has very much changed. And that some of these political categories are a little bit outdated. I think, the Russian political theorist Alexander Dugin, when he talks about the fourth political theory, he's alluding to the fact that what is opposing the United States around the world is not the same old communism, but it's not fascism either, that there is kind of a new formula of kind of rejecting the Western liberal order that has elements of conservatism and elements of the left in it. And it's just kind of a rejection of Western liberalism and individualism.
Yeah, and the other thing I think many people might find surprising is actually in terms of social issues, China is pretty conservative. China probably lines up with the conservative in this country. The church people in China, family values are still very, very important. In fact, I think the Chinese government and throughout the Chinese history believes there's a thing called the 家和万事兴, which means family is doing well, that's when the country is strong. You see, that's very like a family value core of everything. I think probably many conservatives might find this surprising, but you will find more things in common with the Chinese public in terms of the social issues than you probably find with some of the woke left now. Yeah.
Well, that was what I wanted to say when you were talking about the Barbie movie, and you said they're bringing up the gender pronouns and stuff like that, because unfortunately, many people in the Donald Trump camp think that that's communism. They think that stuff is communism, and they think somehow it's connected to China. They think Biden that China is behind wokeness or something like that. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I wish people could understand that there's a gap between Western leftists and what they believe, and what governments around the world that believe in Marxism and socialism believe.
Yeah, that's why a program like ours is important. We need to tell people that. Yeah. Okay.